This is a special edition of the Energy Education Podcast for Wednesday, November 21st, 2012. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairwinds Energy Education. Fairwinds is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. Today on the show, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has dispatched a special investigation team to 2 U.S. nuclear power plants following Hurricane Sandy. We'll talk about why. Also, the hurricane washed out roads and knocked out power. We'll talk about what this means in the big picture of emergency planning. Finally, on today's special edition podcast, we'll look into why some reactor operators have said they'll shut down if forced to spend more money on safety issues. Joining us via Skype is Fairwinds Chief Nuclear Engineer Arnie Gunderson. All coming up next.
Could the United States experience a meltdown like Fukushima Daiichi? Will the mainstream media tell you the whole story about the nuclear industry? When you want answers to what's going on around the world in nuclear news, Fairwinds provides them. And your donations provide the needed funds for us to keep giving you factual information from people with industry experience. Please hit the donate button.
This is the Energy Education Podcast. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick note to our listeners before we get to Arnie. Next week, that's to say next Sunday, we won't have a new edition of the podcast. We're skipping next Sunday for the holiday weekend, but we'll be back the Sunday after that. Now let's get to Arnie. Arnie, thanks for joining us again this week.
Hey, Kevin, thanks. And thanks. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone who's listening.
Well, I want to start right out with 2 special investigation teams that have been dispatched by the NRC, one to Turkey Point and the other to Oyster Creek following Hurricane Sandy. Can you talk a little bit about what they're doing and why they're there?
The NRC doesn't dispatch these teams very often. The key is they're special. But 2 problems happened last week that they felt warranted a lot of extra attention. So they sent these SIT teams, special investigation teams, out. The interesting one is Turkey Point. They had valves go closed, and then they couldn't open them. And the valves were in the system that's designed to cool the nuclear reactor in the service water system. This creates the problem that we've been talking about now since Fukushima Daiichi, which is something called the loss of the ultimate heat sink. So no one knows why these valves closed. They weren't supposed to, and why they couldn't get them back open is even more of a dilemma. So there was a period of about 30 minutes where the cooling system for the nuclear reactor, the emergency core cooling system for the nuclear reactor, was inoperable because these valves had failed failed closed, and they couldn't get them back open again. So the NRC felt that was warranted attention. What the heck is going on here? But then up at Oyster Creek, they had a similar problem, loss of the ultimate heat sink, but for a different cause, which is the Hurricane Sandy. We were talking over the last week here on the podcast about how the storm surge from Sandy came within about 6 inches of wiping out the same system, the emergency service water system. Now, this is supposed to be a robust system and should be immune to these kinds of problems. But here we've had 2 cases in a week where the emergency service water system was compromised. It's disconcerting. At the same time, the NRC's response to send out teams is certainly appropriate because, my God, this is the final line of defense, is being able to cool the nuclear reactor.
So, Arnie, Hurricane Sandy washed out roads and knocked out power. These plants are required to have an emergency evacuation plan. How now, with a lot of this infrastructure damage still there, how now are they planning for an emergency if one were to happen today?
Well, that's a great question. Oyster Creek is in trouble. The infrastructure around the plant, not the plant itself. We're talking about the public roads, the public sewers and shelters and things like that are still being strained because of issues related to Hurricane Sandy. And those are the same pieces of infrastructure that you need in the case of a nuclear accident. So here we've got a plant that plans to come back up. Oyster Creek is planning to come back up any minute now, and yet its emergency evacuation plan won't work in the event that that there would be an accident.
And they'll be allowed to do this?
Well, that's a great question, too. There's an attorney Richard Webster, has determined that Oyster Creek is violating 10 CFR 50, Part 73, which is a clause that says you've got to have an operating evacuation plan to run a nuclear reactor. And you're required to tell the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when you don't have an operable plan. So, Attorney Webster's written to the NRC. He wrote to him yesterday saying, what's going on here? You guys aren't doing your job. The plant for since Sandy now, for 2 weeks now, the plant has had an inoperable emergency plan, and you haven't been notified by the people that run Oyster Creek, and you really haven't been too curious about it either. So both the owner and the NRC are remiss here in failing to apply the law that's on the books to Oyster Creek. It gets more serious than that, because Oyster Creek's the oldest plant in the country. It went online in 1969, and it doesn't have a high-pressure coolant injection system. It's the only plant in the country that doesn't have an HPCI, high-pressure coolant injection system.
Arnie, before you go on, what is a high-pressure coolant injection system?
Well, if there's an accident, the reactor's at a very high pressure, and it would be great to get water into it while it's at a high pressure. Then you would use the high-pressure coolant injection system to pump water into the reactor in the event of an accident. Now, there are other systems. So when the pressure gets lower, you use something called the low-pressure coolant injection system, and there's a couple other systems at Oyster Creek. But you need the high-pressure coolant injection system for something called a small line break accident. That's when a 3-inch line breaks. The reactor stays hot, and it also stays at high pressure. So fluid leaks out through this 3-inch line that's broken, and at Oyster Creek, there's no way to make it up. So what has to happen at Oyster Creek is the operators have to manually open up a whole bunch of relief valves to rapidly drop the pressure. So in order to solve the problem at Oyster Creek, you rely on the operators doing the right thing.
So this is a new technology that Oyster Creek doesn't have because it's one of the older plants.
Right. Nobody thought of high-pressure coolant injection when Oyster Creek was being built. And then afterward, they realized, oh, my God, this is, we really need another safety system, this high-pressure coolant injection system. So it was added to all the other reactors after Oyster Creek. Now, it's worse than that, because just this week, Oyster Creek announced that it found cracks in a 3-inch line. So they're in the process of patching the cracks in the 3-inch line. But so here we've got all of the precursors of an accident. We've got a 3-inch line with cracks. We've got no high-pressure coolant injection system to cool the plant, and we've got an evacuation plan that won't work because Hurricane Sandy has basically wiped out the infrastructure. Here's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission allowing Oyster Creek to run in the 21st century when it doesn't have all of the cooling systems that were invented in the 20th century. Now, you'd think that given they found a crack in a 3-inch pipe that could be a precursor, and given that they need this high-pressure coolant injection system were that pipe to crack, and also given they don't have an evacuation plan, that the NRC would say, whoa, Oyster Creek, we don't want you starting up. But that's not happening. It looks to me like the NRC and Exelon, the owner of Oyster Creek, are merrily on their way to getting this plant back up online, and the public safety is at risk.
So, Arnie, if Exelon wanted to go about getting back online the proper way and getting their emergency plan in line, what would they be doing?
Well, Exelon has already said that if they have to make any improvements to Oyster Creek, they're going to shut it down instead. This came out in their, they had a call with a bunch of stock analysts just this week, and they said that the plant is marginal right now, and they're not making any money on it. If they have to modify it anymore as a result of Hurricane Sandy, it's likely they'll shut it down. Now, it's a second domino to fall. You know, we've had the Kewanee reactor that we talked about 2 weeks ago on the podcast, and they were saying that Kewanee won't start up again after March of 2013 because they just can't afford to keep it running. And so here we've got Exelon management saying that they're not going to make any substantial improvements in Oyster Creek. So basically, the NRC knows that, and if the NRC insists that Oyster Creek actually have an operating emergency plan, actually install a high-pressure coolant injection system, and things like that, they know Exelon will probably shut the reactor down. And I don't think the NRC really wants to be the cause of a nuclear reactor shutting down, despite the fact that it's really all about money versus public safety. The NRC should be on the public safety side, and Exelon should be on the money side. But it looks to me like the NRC is more concerned about Exelon's costs compared to the public safety of people down there in New Jersey. You know, it's not the only one this issue of money keeps coming up. We had two more in the last 2 weeks raise the issue of that they're not really financially viable. Oyster Creek isn't the only reactor that's experiencing financial problems. We've got Kewanee we know about, but two others have popped up on the radar this week, and they're surprising because they're newer reactors. The Wolf Creek reactor announced that it's looking for a partner to share engineering with. In other words, they want to lay off engineers and spread the engineering load over more reactors, so they can get fewer nuclear engineers per reactor to drop their costs. And Callaway said the same thing. Both of these are new reactors in the Midwest. They're saying basically that the cost to run a nuclear reactor makes them uncompetitive in today's environment. So we've got 4 reactors in the last month talking about they're having trouble making economic sense about running. Kewanee, Oyster Creek, Callaway, and Wolf Creek. And you got to believe there's others out there too. Quite a few nuclear plants are losing money at night. At night when there's extra load, the cost of other people providing power is much lower than nuclear plants. So the nuclear plants are no longer the low-cost provider of power.
So several plants considering shutting down if it gets more expensive. I think in 5th grade we would have said, is that a threat or a promise? Is that a threat or a promise?
I think, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is painfully aware that if they make these plants any safer, they'll make them more costly. And they don't want to make them more costly. This is at the commission level. There's 4 of the 5 commissioners, with the exception of the new chairman, Allison McFarland, have basically said that nuclear power is safe enough as it is, and we really don't see any need to make any changes. Then the market is sending signals saying, if you make any changes, we're going to start shutting these guys down. So, again, I think that we're confusing public safety and economics, and the NRC's sole focus should be on public safety. But it looks to me that at the commission level, they've made the decision that we're really not going to see safety changes as a result of the Daiichi accident. And, therefore the plants are not going to be as safe, but they're going to be more economic to run, which keeps a lot of their corporations in business. We're seeing this elsewhere too. We're seeing it at Fort Calhoun in the Midwest. This is a really old reactor as well. Fort Calhoun is the one that was flooded, and the one I talked about saying that sandbags and nuclear plants don't belong in the same sentence. Well, Fort Calhoun is costing something between $5 and $10 million a month to pay the salaries of the people who are not producing electricity. Now, this plant hasn't been producing electricity since April of last year. So, we're looking at more than a year when all these people are making salaries, and so we're looking at over 100 million, pushing 200 million at a power plant that the world is telling us is not economical to operate. But what happens there is that the people in this is part of the Nebraska Public Power District. The people in the Midwest have been funding these salaries for so long in their electric bill that they really don't realize they're spending $5 or $10 million a month paying salaries for people to not operate a nuclear power plant. Just this week, the people at Fort Calhoun came out and said that they found structural problems at the plant. And now they're going to have to be shut down even longer. Structural problems in the nuclear containment that they were unaware of.
So, Arnie, maybe you can help me understand about how expensive is it to keep running these plants when they're shut down? And when I say running, I don't mean to have the reactor running and to have the plant providing power, but rather, obviously the plant has to employ safety personnel and engineers, and, all of the employees for a plant must still cost money. How expensive is that for a plant that's shut down?
Yeah, the power plant out in California offers an example of a situation where this is the San Onofre plant. They've got close to 2,000 people, and they're highly paid engineers, bringing in upwards of $100,000 a year on average. So you're looking at more than $100 million a year, pushing $200 million a year for the San Onofre plant to sit idle for these people to collect salaries, basically producing no electricity. There's two more examples besides the San Onofre plant. The first example is Fort Calhoun, and they've got a staff of about 600 or 700. And again, that's probably $60 to $100 million a year being spent to keep a plant idle. And the other one here is on the East Coast is Crystal River down in Florida, and it's got a huge staff, and it's likely costing $150 million a year to keep idle. Now, Crystal River is going to be shut down for 5 or 6 years with containment problems. Here's Fort Calhoun plant now has containment problems. Now Crystal River has containment problems. So these plants will be shut down for 5 years, and they'll pay the salaries of more than 1,000 people for 5 years to produce no power. The analogy I like to say is that I like to compare it to the NFL. If you've got a quarterback who breaks his arm, you'll let him sit out a season, and that's sort of understandable. But the expectation is he comes back at the end of the season. Well, here we've got Crystal River is going to be down for 6 years. What NFL team would make the business decision to keep their quarterback on the sidelines and pay his exorbitant salary for 6 years, hoping that sooner or later he'll come back and lead the team again? And the same with San Onofre. San Onofre Unit 3 is likely shut down forever, and Unit 2 is going to be shut down for more than a year and likely never get to 100% power again. And yet we've got this expensive quarterback, all of these hundreds and hundreds of highly paid engineers sitting on the sideline, and in the back of our minds we keep saying, well, sooner or later it will run. Businesses don't make that decision. Utilities make that decision when they can take the money from ratepayers out of your electric bill. The utilities, Crystal River is owned by a utility, but what that means is that whether it runs or not, the people that own Crystal River get paid. The same with San Onofre and the same with Fort Calhoun. Whether it runs or not, those staffs get paid because they get it out of your electric bill. The other plants, Kewanee and Oyster Creek, are what we call merchant plants. And when they're not running, they're not getting any money. And management suddenly behaves like business people. They pull the plug on a plant and they say, we can't afford to operate this plant. So what we're seeing in the nuclear industry is a split. The people that are running merchant plants that aren't really connected to any single utility, they just sell power out on the grid, are looking at the balance sheets on these nuclear reactors and they're saying, these don't make any sense. And the same thing is happening. Fort Calhoun or San Onofre or Crystal River don't make any sense either. But because ratepayers have been paying these salaries for 10 or 20 or 30 years in their rate base, they don't feel like somebody has just lifted $200 million from their pocket. If ratepayers understood that these plants shut down is like having your quarterback on the sideline for 5 years, they might demand of their public utility commissions, why are we spending, in the case of Crystal River, $750 million in salaries for people to sit around at a power plant that's not operating? It doesn't make business sense, but the utility commissions in Florida and California are turning a blind eye to that. And they're basically in a very highly paid employment program for engineers to sit around and produce no power.
Arnie, wouldn't it be nice if Fairwinds was funded by the ratepayers in the U.S.?
Boy, that would make my day, I'll tell you, Kevin. Just essentially send us 8 million people watch the Fairwinds website since the Fukushima Daiichi accident. And if everybody just left $1 at our door for every time they viewed the site, I'll tell you, we would be 10 times more, 100 times better as on reporting the news than we are now. Yes, we don't tap into your pocketbook through an IV line and drain cash routinely like utilities do. We rely on donations, and it's Thanksgiving, and I hope that maybe Fairwinds is one of the things you're thankful for. Between now and the end of the year, Fairwinds is trying to raise funds both from corporations and large donors and also small donors. And I'll tell you, it's very humbling to go to the mailbox and get that and open an envelope that says thank you. Here's $20. I really appreciate everything you're doing. It really makes me aware of how little information is out there that the mainstream media is not covering, and we really try our best. But we can't do it for zero funds, and would certainly appreciate a donation.
Arnie Gunderson, it sounds like you have some action going on in the background there.
Yeah, there's some kids playing out right outside of my Skype connection with you.
Joining us via Skype from on the road, Arnie Gunderson, Fairwinds Chief Nuclear Engineer. Arnie, thanks for coming on for this special edition. I also want to remind viewers that there will be no regular Sunday podcast this coming Sunday because of the holiday. So the special edition podcast will stay up until next Sunday.
All right. Well, thank you again, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Well, that about does it for this special edition podcast. As a reminder, we won't have a new podcast this coming Sunday, but we'll be back next Sunday to discuss more on what's happening in the world of nuclear news. For Fairwinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.